Step out of the car, now." The officer's voice cracked through the California heat like a whip. Sirens still echoed faintly from down the boulevard. But here on Rodeo Drive, the sound that gripped everyone's attention was the silence that followed. A red Ferrari, spotless and gleaming under the July sun, idled at the curb. Its engine purred like a beast held back on a leash. The man behind the wheel didn't flinch. He turned the key, killed the engine, and stepped out smooth, calm, composed. Black, mid-30s, sharp charcoal suit, skin glowing under the light, no jewelry, no flashy watch. Just him, and the kind of confidence that says, "I've been through worse." But that confidence, it didn't matter to the two LAPD officers now circling the car with one hand always hovering near their holsters. A blonde tourist whispered, "That can't be his car." Next to her, a guy in flip-flops started recording with his phone. "Watch this," he muttered. "Dude's about to get roasted." The taller officer pointed at the Ferrari's emblem. "This vehicle was reported stolen less than an hour ago. Where did you get it?" He didn't answer, just looked at the man like he'd asked whether the sky was real. "You have ID, registration?" the cop barked. Still, the man said nothing. He glanced around at the luxury storefronts, at the growing crowd, at the boy barely out of college live streaming this like it was entertainment. Then slowly, very slowly, he reached into his jacket. The shorter cop flinched. "Keep your hands where I can see them." He froze, hands open. "You sure you want to go down this road?" he asked, voice calm as stone. People leaned in. Tension crackled. Someone whispered, "He's hiding something." But here's the thing. You could see it in his eyes. He wasn't scared, just disappointed. Like he'd been here before, like the script hadn't changed in 20 years. He took out his wallet, not fast, not slow, just deliberate, and slid something out. Not a license, not a passport, a single folded receipt. The taller officer scoffed, "That better be good." But he didn't hand it over. He looked straight at the camera of the kid live streaming and said, "You might want to keep recording. Now pause a moment. If you were standing there, would you think this man had stolen the car? Or would you wonder why he looked like the only one not panicking? And more than that, have you ever been judged just by what you wore or the color of your skin?" Because what happened next? That's when jaws started dropping. Let me tell you what he handed them and why the receipt wasn't just proof of ownership. It was proof of everything they refused to believe. The taller cop snatched the paper from his hand like it was evidence in a crime scene. You could hear the crinkle as he unfolded it, not quickly, not slowly, but like he already knew it wasn't going to matter. It was just a receipt, right? But this one was different. On thick, cream-colored cardstock, printed with gold-trimmed borders, were three things that didn't fit the scene they thought they were part of. The name Ferrari Beverly Hills, a purchase price for $118,770, a signature, Derek J. Kane. There was no hesitation in his name, no middle initial to hide behind, just clean, confident lettering. But the cop didn't blink. Instead, he smirked. "Anyone can print this," he muttered. Then, louder, for the growing crowd, "Sir, if this is real, you'll have no problem verifying it." The crowd shifted. The guy with the phone kept recording, now zooming in on the paper. A girl behind him whispered, "Wait, that's the dealership 2 blocks from here." But the officers didn't care. They didn't see proof. They saw a story that didn't fit their assumptions. One officer radioed in. The other circled the Ferrari, inspecting its VIN. And Derek, he didn't move, just stood there, arms crossed, watching a situation he'd lived versions of 100 times before. You could see it in his jaw clench, but not trembling. In his eyes steady, but tired. Why is it when a black man drives something expensive, the first question isn't how, but did you steal it? He'd worked 20 years for this. Built a tech company from his dorm room. Raised 3 rounds of venture capital. Sat in rooms full of men who doubted him because he didn't wear Patagonia or talk like Silicon Valley. And now, on the day he finally let himself celebrate, took the damn roof off his life and drove the Ferrari with the top down. This This doesn't match the report, the shorter cop finally said, tapping the radio. But the car is the same model, the taller one pushed back. Different VIN, different color. Silence. For a moment, you could feel the world hold its breath. But it wasn't relief. It was hesitation. Because now they had a problem. They might be wrong. So what do people do when the facts don't match their assumptions? Do they apologize? Or do they double down? One of the officers stepped back toward Derek. We'll still need to bring you in for questioning. He laughed. Just once. Quiet, but sharp. Questioning, he said. For what? Buying my own car. His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the noise like a blade. People started murmuring. Phones stopped filming. A few hands lowered, maybe embarrassed, maybe unsure whose side they were on now. Let me ask you something. If you showed up with every piece of proof, a receipt, a signature, a company badge, even your name on the building, and they still didn't believe you, what would you do? Would you walk away? Would you fight? Would you try to explain yourself one more time just to be heard? Or would you do what Derek did next? Because what he did wasn't loud, wasn't angry, but it changed everything. And it made one of the officers freeze like someone had whispered a secret in his ear. Stick around because next, you'll see how Derek didn't just defend himself. He exposed something much, much bigger. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't even ask for a manager because he knew, in that moment, he was the highest authority on that sidewalk. Instead, Derek pulled out his phone, no hesitation, no scrolling. Just one swipe, one tap. Then he lifted it to his ear and said, "Patch me to Paul, now." The officer nearest to him took a step back, confused. The crowd, still watching. Some were trying to act casual, like they weren't hanging on every word. But they were, every one of them. 10 seconds passed. Then Derek spoke again, this time slower, more deliberate. "This is Kane. I'm at the front of Beverly Hills Ferrari. There's been a misunderstanding. Let's fix it." He hung up without waiting for a reply. The taller cop narrowed his eyes. Who was that? Derek didn't answer. But he didn't need to, because 30 seconds later, a sharply dressed man in a gray three-piece suit rushed out of the dealership. Down the street, face pale, voice panicked. "Mr. Kane," he called out, holding a tablet in one hand and a lanyard ID flapping around his neck. "My sincerest apologies. I had no idea you were back in town. This is completely unacceptable." Gasps rippled through the onlookers like a dropped glass shattering on marble. The man, Paul, the general manager of Ferrari Beverly Hills, turned to the officers. His voice firm now. "This man is our top-tier platinum client. That car was hand-delivered to him less than 4 hours ago. You've made a mistake." Suddenly the authorities shifted. The cops looked at each other, words caught in their throats. Derek stepped forward, not in anger, but in presence. The kind of presence that says, "I don't need to yell, I already won." Then he turned to the crowd. No speech, no bloating. Just one glance, direct, unapologetic. And for the first time that day, they looked away first. Because the truth wasn't just uncomfortable, it was undeniable. One woman near the back whispered, "Wait, Kane, isn't he on the Forbes list?" Another man murmured, "He owns K6 Ventures, right? The AI platform." It spread like wildfire, not just across the corner, but through every screen that had been recording. TikTok, Twitter, local news. Black man accused of stealing his own Ferrari, turns out he built the company. That powers half of Wall Street's trading bots. Let me ask you something. When public opinion shifts this fast, is it justice or is it fear? And more than that, would any of this have changed if he weren't rich? Because Derek, he didn't look relieved. He looked tired. Tired of having to prove himself in spaces he already belonged. Tired of seeing heads turn only after someone important vouched for him. Tired of carrying receipts not for tax records, but for survival. And just when things looked like they'd settle, one of the officers muttered, "We still have to file a report." He didn't comply when first approached. Paul, the manager, turned to him, jaw tight. "File whatever you want, but I'll be forwarding this to the city's legal counsel and to your chief." The officer froze. But that wasn't even the worst part, because what Derek did next, that's what exposed a pattern that went far beyond one man and one car. Stick around, because in part 4, you'll see what happened when the city itself got involved and why Derek didn't stop at clearing his name. He made sure it would never happen again. Before I tell you what he revealed in front of the entire department, I know you might be busy. Maybe you've got errands to run, or maybe your mind can only handle so much drama at once. But if stories like this fascinate you about power, prejudice, and the moment things flip, hit subscribe. You don't want to miss how it all unfolds. Now, after Paul made the call, it took less than 24 hours for the mayor's office to reach out. Not with flowers, with an emergency statement. See, it wasn't just the footage that went viral. It was the conversation underneath it. Thousands of people weren't just outraged at the stop, they were sharing their own stories. The hashtags trended by nightfall. Driving Willow Black, receipt means nothing, Canna did nothing, and beneath the digital firestorm, something else started bubbling. The question no one wanted to answer. If this happened to a billionaire, what's happening to everyone else? Derek didn't speak to reporters, didn't give interviews, not yet. But behind the scenes, he called his lawyer, then his team, then the chair of the Civilian Oversight Board for the LAPD. And that's when the shift began. He wasn't interested in suing for money. He didn't want a headline apology. He wasn't after ego. He wanted data. How many black men, he asked the board chair over Zoom, have been stopped by your officers in luxury cars this year? Silence. Then, we don't track that specifically. He smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. Then I'll help you track it. Within 48 hours, Derek offered something unexpected: full funding for an independent audit of the city's vehicle stop protocols through a non-profit he chaired quietly in the background, not to protect himself, to expose the system. Let me ask you, if you had the chance to strike back, not just at the people who wronged you, but at the structure that let it happen again and again, would you take it? Or would you walk away, cash the settlement, and forget it? Derek didn't walk. He leaned in. And that's when the media started panicking, because his internal reports leaked. And they did leak. Names, patterns, timestamps started piling up. Officers stopping men for looking out of place. Cars flagged for vague suspicious behavior. Luxury purchases scrutinized not because they were fraudulent, but because the driver was black. But here's the twist. Derek wasn't interested in canceling anyone. He wanted records. He wanted transparency. He wanted change. And he had the power, resources, and public spotlight to demand it in a way no one could ignore. So he made a promise. On camera, 10 days after the incident, at a public forum streamed across the country, Derek Kane stepped to the podium, looked into the lens, and said, "This isn't just about me. I'll be fine. I have lawyers. I have money. But how many others don't? I don't want revenge. I want reform." But the next voice that took the mic, that was unexpected. And it changed everything again. Stick around, because in part 5, the person who stood up next was someone no one expected to defend Derek. Not even him. He was about to leave the stage. The applause hadn't even died down. But just as Derek turned to step off the podium, a voice from the back of the room cut through the murmur. Wait. The room quieted instantly. Phones were lifted again. Journalists leaned forward. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a challenge. It was a request, steady, unexpected, and carried by a voice that didn't belong to any activist or supporter in the crowd. A uniform moved through the aisle. Navy blue, silver badge, LAPD. But not one of the ones who had stopped him. This was someone else. She stepped into the light. Captain Renee Alston, 27 years on the force, commanded the precincts, decorated, respected, and white. Every camera in the room pivoted toward her, and she didn't flinch. "I've served the city for almost 3 decades, she said, "and I've seen more than I can say. But last week, when I saw the video of you of what happened, I didn't sleep. No one expected this. Not Derek, Not the mayors sitting the seats away. Not the press, who were now scrambling to caption the moment in real time. Alston kept going. "I'm not here to defend what happened," she said. "I can't. It was wrong. And it happens more often than any of us are willing to admit." She looked at Derek, then did something no one saw coming. She took off her badge and placed it gently on the table beside the mic. "I don't get to take back the years of silence, but I can start now." The room held its breath, because in one gesture, she flipped the script, not by denying the system, but by owning her place in it, and by choosing, finally, to speak. "Let me ask you something. If someone who's always been part of the problem suddenly decides to stand on your side, do you trust them? Do you question their motive? Or do you accept that maybe people can change?" Derek didn't clap. He didn't shake her hand. He just looked her in the eye, nodded once slow, steady, and said, "Thank you." And in that silence, there was no performance, no press spin, no applause line. Just a moment, a crack in the wall, one small shift that meant something real. Later that evening, the video of Alston's speech went viral on its own. Not because she apologized, but because she admitted something far rarer in public service: complicity. And because of that moment, something started happening inside the force. Other officers quietly, anonymously began emailing the audit team. Whistleblowers, logs, patterns, testimonies. Derek's team didn't ask for it, but it came. Because when one person in power breaks the silence, it gives others permission to do the same. And what came next? It wasn't just data. It was something far more dangerous and far more powerful. Stick around, because in part 6, we uncover what those internal files revealed, and why one precinct tried to bury them before anyone could see. At first, the files trickled in. Unmarked envelopes, flash drives slipped under office doors, anonymous inboxes lighting up after midnight. Some came from rookies who'd only been on the job a year, others from veterans who'd seen too much for too long. Each one carried pieces of a puzzle no one wanted solved. But Derek's team, they were watching everything, cataloging, verifying. Then it happened. A single file flagged red. A precinct in Westwood had run an internal traffic stop analysis quietly 3 years ago. Never published, never shared. Why? Because the data was damning. Over 70% of all suspicious vehicle stops involving luxury cars had targeted Black or Latino drivers, despite representing less than 12% of high-end vehicle owners in the area. Of those stops, only 2% resulted in actual criminal findings. Nearly 60% were marked as unverified suspicion. Most stops occurred near shopping districts, luxury dealerships, or private schools. One note in the report summary read, "Uniformed presence is recommended in affluent zones. During weekends, particular attention to high-risk appearance mismatch." Appearance mismatch. That phrase alone chilled the room when Derek read it aloud during a closed-door session with his legal team. Not behavior, not reports, not stolen plates. Just he doesn't look like he should be driving that car. Let me ask you something. If a system is built on assumptions that never get questioned, when does bias stop being personal and start becoming policy? But that wasn't the worst part. Buried in the metadata of the file, barely visible, was an edit log. The report had been altered, stripped down, language softened, entire sections missing from the final version submitted to oversight. And who approved the final cut? Captain Mitchell Hayes, the same man who once served on the board of the West Side Business Alliance, where Derek had pitched his startup a decade ago. Back then, Derek had been brushed off, told his idea was ambitious but misplaced. Hayes was there, smiled politely, walked him to the elevator, never called back. Now he was back on paper as the man who signed off on hiding the truth. Derek didn't flinch. He forwarded the files to the audit team, then to the mayor's office, then to every journalist who'd asked him for comment in the last 10 days. And then he waited. But Hayes didn't, because within 36 hours of the leak, Captain Hayes held a private press conference, closed to the public, no questions allowed. He claimed the documents were outdated and lacked context. He called Derek's release reckless. He said, "We can't let reform be driven by revenge." But Derek, he didn't say a word. Not yet, because there was still more he hadn't shown. A folder still sealed, a file still untouched, because the real bombshell wasn't just who signed off the edits. It was who wrote the original version, the raw, unedited draft. And that name, that's what made Derek stop mid-sentence when he saw it. Because it wasn't a stranger. It was someone he once trusted. Stick around because in part 7, you'll find out who tried to warn him years ago, and why their silence since then might be the key to everything unraveling. Her name was Ava Sinclair. Derek hadn't heard it in nearly 8 years. Back when they were both just grinding their way through the system, Ava is an internal data analyst for LAPD's Community Relations Division. Derek still pitching series of funding to cold-eyed investors who barely remembered his name after coffee. They met once, briefly. It was at a diversity panel hosted by the city full of suits saying the right things and doing none of them. Afterward, she pulled him aside. "I read about your work," she said. "Machine learning for financial patterns. You should think about applying it to policy." He laughed at the time. "I've got enough systems rejecting me already," he'd said. But then she leaned in voice low, almost scared. "You don't know what's being written behind closed doors." He never forgot the way she said written. Not done, not aloud, not even said. Written. And now 8 years later, there it was. Her name on the unedited report, the one that had been buried, altered, sanitized. Author, A. Sinclair. It wasn't just a statistician's draft. It was a warning, an alarm bell that had been silenced before anyone could hear it. And maybe she tried to ring it through him. But why hadn't she said anything since? Why disappear? Derek had his team search city records. Turns out, Ava transferred departments 6 months after that panel, moved to public safety oversight, then quietly resigned 2 years later. No interviews, no LinkedIn updates, nothing. Gone. Until now. Because the night after the files leaked, he received an email. No subject line, no signature, just one sentence. "I told you they wouldn't listen." Attached a PDF. It was her original report, dated, time-stamped, and never before seen. It contained something the edited version had removed, a section titled Behavioral Assumption Index. In it, Ava had written, "Officers are not always aware of the cultural, socioeconomic, or implicit cues driving their assessments. However, the pattern of stops, particularly those in wealth-concentrated zones, suggests a subconscious reinforcement of stereotypes tied to vehicle type, driver appearance, and setting mismatch." She even included suggestions, sensitivity bias training, quarterly review boards, real-time data tracking by race and location. All of it was cut, all of it ignored. Let me ask you something. If you risk your career to speak up once, and no one listens, would you risk it again? Or would you stay quiet? Hope someone else says it louder. But Ava didn't stay silent this time. The next day, during a live-streamed public safety meeting, she stepped into the light. Her hair longer now, eyes sharper, but the voice still steady, still brave. "I authored that report," she said, standing at the mic. "I buried it after I realized no one was willing to protect the truth. But I can't do that anymore." Gasps in the room, cameras clicking like static. "I left," she continued, "because staying meant lying by omission. And I didn't join the department to be part of a cover-up. I joined to protect people, all people." She looked directly at Derek seated in the front row, and for the first time in years, he saw her, not as the whisper behind the curtain, but as the voice finally stepping onto the stage. And just as she turned to leave, a man at the side of the room stood abruptly. It was Hayes, red-faced, breathing hard, holding a folder. He wasn't done fighting, but what he said next revealed far more than he intended. Stick around because in part 8, Hayes finally speaks, and in doing so, he exposes a secret no one saw coming, not even Ava. Hayes stood stiff, fists clenched around a slim leather folder that now looked more like a weapon than a report. His face was flushed, jaw pulsing with every word he tried not to say but couldn't hold back. "This," he barked, pointing toward Ava, then toward Derek. "This isn't how we fix things. You think dragging us into public, shaming the entire department, is going to help?" The room froze. It wasn't just the tone. It was the panic under the surface, the crack in the armor. Ava didn't respond. Neither did Derek, because something about his voice wasn't just offensive. It was scared. "You're cherry-picking data," Hayes snapped, taking reports out of context, ignoring the nuances. "Nuances like who gets stopped," Ava replied, calm but sharp. Hayes shot her a look, and then it happened. The moment no one expected. He said it, loud to loud. "We didn't create those protocols, Ava. We just enforced them." Silence. And then Derek leaned forward, slow. "Protocols." Hayes froze. You could almost hear the breath leave his body. He looked around the room at the mayor's aides, at the cameras, at the journalists now wide-eyed and scrambling. "I didn't mean," but it was too late, because the word had landed. And it wasn't just a word. It was a crack in the wall, one that revealed something deeper, something structured, not accidental, not unconscious, not just a few bad apples. "Let me ask you something. If someone lets the truth slip out in anger, do you trust that moment more than their carefully crafted statements?" Because Hayes, he didn't just admit bias. He admitted design. "Explain," Derek said, not a question, a command. Hayes opened the folder, hands shaking now. Inside were memos interdepartmental, marked internal use only, some from precinct captains, some from civilian liaison units. One, at the very bottom, stamped with a red seal from the Office of City Risk. Not police, not city council. Liability management, the kind of department whose only job is to reduce financial exposure. And what did those memos say? Soft language, careful phrasing. But the intent was clear. In high-value districts, vehicle surveillance protocols should err on the side of visible presence. Incongruent driver profile should trigger secondary verification. Do not document subjectively unless prompted by incident escalation. Ava stepped forward, took the top memo, and read it aloud. Incongruent driver profile. 3 words. That meant everything. A black man in a suit, a Latino teen in a Tesla, an immigrant family in a BMW. Incongruent. That was the word they used to justify suspicion. To build a wall and hide it behind policy. Hayes lowered his head, quiet now. Not out of respect, but defeat. "It wasn't just me," he said. "They told us to be proactive, to protect image, to minimize risk. Risk, not to protect people, to protect brands, reputation, optics." And suddenly this wasn't about one Ferrari on one street in Beverly Hills. It was about every boardroom, every courtroom, every luxury space that whispered, "We welcome all," but really meant, "as long as you look like us." Let me ask you, if systems are built to protect institutions over individuals, can they ever truly be reformed? Or do they have to be rebuilt from the ground up? Derek didn't answer, not yet, because he wasn't finished digging. He turned to Ava. "I need access to the Risk Office archives, full logs. All directives issued in the last 5 years." She nodded, and just as the room began to buzz again, someone from the back, a woman in a gray blazer, stepped forward. No badge, no title. But when she spoke, every camera turned, because her voice carried the chill of someone who'd written those memos herself. Stick around, because in Part 9, the woman from the Risk Office speaks, and what she says will change the way you think about power, protection, and prejudice. She moved with a kind of precision that made people uneasy, like she was already calculating 3 outcomes ahead. Tailored gray blazer, white silk blouse, thin, dark-rimmed glasses that didn't hide the steel in her eyes. She didn't wait to be introduced. "My name is Elise Carr," she said, stepping into the circle of microphones. "Director of Strategic Risk and Civil Containment, Office of City Risk." Even her title sounded like a euphemism. She didn't smile, didn't glance at Hayes, didn't flinch under Derek's stare. "I've seen the memos," she said. "I wrote some of them." A low murmur rippled through the room, but she wasn't finished. "You're assuming malice," she continued. "That's not what this is. Our job is to reduce potential lawsuits, public incidents, and liabilities. We assess statistical trends, patterns. We flag risk before it becomes cost." Cost? That word again. Always money, never people. Ava crossed her arms. "And what does incongruent driver profile mean in human terms?" Elise didn't blink. "It means deviation from expected demographic indicators based on area wealth metrics. No emotion, just numbers, just math." But that's the thing about hiding behind language eventually. Someone calls it out. Derek stepped forward. "You sanitize prejudice," he said. "Gave it a professional wardrobe and a vocabulary fit for legal defense." Elise turned toward him slowly. "No," she said. "We protected the city. We shielded departments from media storms, from peer crises. And yes, we monitored optics, because perception drives outrage, and outrage drives lawsuits. Let me ask you something. If a system doesn't punish injustice, but simply tries to manage the reaction to it, is it still broken? Or is it functioning exactly as designed?" Elise looked calm, too calm. "We never told officers who to stop," she added. "We never issued orders of discrimination. What we did was provide guidelines, and those guidelines were based on risk analysis." "Risk to who?" Derek asked. A pause, and in that pause a truth lingered. Not risk to citizens, risk to institutions, risk to reputations, risk to brand value. Because when cities become brands and law enforcement becomes optics management, justice is no longer blind. It's curated, scripted, optimized. Elise lifted a folder from her case and placed it on the table. "This is every directive we issued over the last 6 years. Unredacted, verified, legal." It thudded softly. Hundreds of pages. Policy written not in hate but in fear. Ava opened it. Her hands trembled, just slightly. Inside were flowcharts, response matrices, decision trees that led from words like non-compliant energy to authorized secondary stop. Language so clean it slipped past scrutiny. But underneath it all the same message. Trust is earned through appearance. Doubt is justified by deviation. Derek scanned a page, then another. His eyes stopped on one chart, a national overlay. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't just Beverly Hills. This protocol wasn't local. It was modeled, tested, scaled. The data came from 10 cities. The templates matched. The signatures from risk offices in Chicago, Atlanta, Houston, D.C. What he'd faced wasn't a one-time event. It was a blueprint. "Let me ask you, if the system is this deep, this widespread, do you think one man can dismantle it? Or does it take something more?" Derek looked up, his voice steady. "I'm going to every one of those cities, one by one." But before he could take a step, Elise said one final thing. "Be careful, Mr. Kane." And the way she said it, it wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Because the next city on that map was the one he grew up in. Stick around because in part 10, Derek returns home. And what he finds there is a memory buried under silence waiting to be unlocked. The sign still squeaked when it swung in the wind. "Welcome to Marlin Heights Estate, 1964. A small, cracked wooden board nailed to a pole off the freeway. Faded paint. Overgrown grass. Just like he remembered. Derek hadn't been back in nearly 12 years. Not since the company went public. Not since the awards, the press. The handshakes from people who once ignored his mother at the grocery store. Now, he was back. Not as a visitor, not as a success story, but as a man retracing a trail he hadn't dared walk since he left. The air smelled of dry pine and dust, the kind of scent that clings to childhood and to secrets. He pulled into the driveway of the house he grew up in. It hadn't changed. Same chipped steps, same humming porch light that flickered even in the day. His mother was waiting at the door. She didn't say much, just opened her arms. Held him for longer than she used to, and whispered, "I knew you'd come back when it got too loud." They didn't talk about the media storm, or Lee's car, or risk office protocols. Not yet. Instead, she made him tea. And then, when the sun dipped low behind the backyard fence, she said, "You remember the mall incident?" Derek blinked. He hadn't thought about that day in years. Not since he buried it like all the other quiet humiliations kids learn to survive. He was 13, walking home from the mall, holding a bag with a single video game, a used copy, paid in full with allowance he'd saved for 2 months. Then the security guard stopped him, said the sensors went off, said they needed to verify, made him empty the bag, then his pockets, then his shoes. Right there, in front of the food court, people watching, snickering. No apology, just a grunt and a wave when they found the receipt. His mother had shown up 15 minutes later, breathless, eyes burning. She'd argued, loud, firm. And the guard? He said something Derek never forgot. "Ma'am, we're trained to be alert for irregular patterns." Irregular patterns. He didn't know what it meant then. Now he did. It was the same phrase Elise used last week, dressed in new words, but rooted in the same rot. "Let me ask you something. How many moments from your childhood did you chalk up as just the way things are, only to realize later they were warning signs?" Derek leaned back in his chair. "What did you do after that day?" he asked his mom. She hesitated, then stood, walked to a drawer, unlocked a box, pulled out a folder he'd never seen. Inside, papers, filed complaints, names, store reports, witness statements, and one photo. A grainy security cam image of young Derek, eyes wide, arms lifted, standing barefoot on a tile floor. "I tried," she said. "I tried to fight, but no one wanted to hear it, not back then." "Why keep all this?" She looked at him, not angry, not sad, just clear. "Because I knew one day someone would finally ask the right question." That night, Derek stayed up reading every document. The names matched people still working in policy boards. One even wrote for the regional division of the risk office. What happened to him wasn't random. It was part of a longer line, one he hadn't seen until he stood far enough away. But now, he was close again, and the only person who might have the full story was his uncle, a retired officer, one who was working mall detail. The day it happened. Stick around, because in part 11, Derek confronts the one man who saw everything and never said a word. His uncle still lived on the edge of town. Same 2-bedroom house, same creaking screen door, same porch swing that used to lull Derek to sleep during summer storms. Officer Gerald Kane, retired after 31 years, commended, decorated, never promoted past lieutenant, but always respected. Derek knocked once. The door opened before his knuckles landed a second time. Gerald didn't smile. He just nodded, stepped aside, and said, "Figured you'd come." They sat in silence at the kitchen table. Black coffee, no sugar, no warmth either. The air was thick, not with anger, but something heavier. "Memory. Let's not pretend," Derek said. "You were working mall security rotation that week. You saw what happened." His uncle didn't deny it. "I did." "Then why didn't you speak up?" Gerald took a long sip, set the mug down, looked at the grain of the table like it might offer answers. "Because they told me to stand down." Derek stiffened. "They, my captain, the store manager, even someone from city admin, said the boy wasn't hurt. Said your mama raised hell already. Said making it official would only stir things worse. And you listened." Gerald finally met his gaze. "I was a black cop in a department that barely wanted me there in the first place. One wrong move, and I lose the only protection I had, even if it meant leaving me exposed." Derek's voice cracked. "Your own blood." Gerald didn't flinch, but something in his eyes shifted. Regret, maybe. "I thought I was keeping you safe," he said quietly. "By keeping it quiet. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been hurt more by someone who said they loved you than by the people who didn't care at all? Because that's what silence does. It doesn't stab. It erodes. Slow, steady, permanent." Derek pushed the folder his mother gave him across the table. Gerald flipped through it, page by page, until he reached the photo. His hand froze. "You kept this?" "She did. I didn't even know it existed." Gerald closed his eyes. For a moment, he looked older than Derek had ever seen him. "There's something else," he finally said. He stood, walked to a hallway closet, pulled down a worn shoebox. Inside cassette tapes, labeled, stacked, dusty. He found the one he was looking for, held it in both hands. "This," he said, "was the original incident report. I recorded it after the store manager made the call." "You recorded it?" "Standard back then. Precinct line had auto log. We were supposed to erase after 24 hours if no action was filed." "But you didn't." He shook his head. "Something told me to keep it, not sure if it was guilt or fear or maybe hope." Derek reached out, took the tape. It was heavier than it looked. "Do you know what's on it?" Gerald nodded slowly. "They didn't just flag you for suspicion. They were told to look out for local colored kids trying to blend. That was the phrase." Silence swallowed the room. Derek didn't breathe, didn't blink, because this was confirmation. The first real thread, verifiable, audible, and damning. "Will you testify?" he asked. Gerald didn't answer right away. "Then I will." One word, but it shattered to decades of silence. And it meant one thing. The story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to the system, the courts, the country. But first, that tape had to be played. Stick around because in part 12, Derek brings the forgotten evidence to light. And what happens next leaves the courtroom in stunned silence. The courtroom was silent. No gavel, no objections. Just the sound of a tape clicking into place and the faint static of a machine that hadn't been used in years. Reporters lined the back wall. Civil rights attorneys filled the gallery. Derek sat at the front table, shoulders square, eyes fixed ahead. Beside him Ava, Gerald, calm, steady, ready. The judge gave a slow nod. "You may proceed." The technician hit play. At first nothing, just hiss. Then a voice, crackling, tired, flat. "Marlin Heights Mall, store security to precinct. We've detained a possible suspect. Young black male, hoodie, sneakers, purchased item looks clean, but behavior flagged by manager. Could be one of those local colored kids trying to blend, requesting soft follow-up, low visibility." Gasps rippled like a wave across the room. But the tape wasn't done. Another voice chimed in deeper, official, clipped. "Copy, Officer Kane nearby. Send him. No report unless incident escalates. Keep optics low. We don't want noise from parents again." Click. End of tape. And then silence. The kind that hums in your chest, that tells you something irreversible just happened. Let me ask you something. What do you do when the lie becomes undeniable? When the memory you carried alone suddenly becomes evidence? Derek stood slowly. The judge didn't stop him. No one could. He walked to the front, faced the gallery, the cameras, the world, and said, "That was me, that child, standing barefoot, holding my own receipt, while adults with power decided I didn't belong." He looked at the jury. "At 13, I thought it was my fault, that maybe I looked suspicious. Maybe I didn't smile enough. Maybe my hoodie was the wrong color." Pause. "But the tape proves it was never about me. It was the system scripted, practiced, passed down." He turned to the judge. "I don't want revenge. I want recognition. I want policy changed. I want every kid like me past or present to know they weren't crazy. They weren't paranoid. They were targeted." A tear slipped down his mother's cheek. Ava gripped the table, and Gerald bowed his head. The judge called a recess. But the moment, it didn't pause. It erupted. Outside, reporters scrambled. Headlines fired across the country. Hashtags trended within minutes. Receipts are drowned. System exposed. Barefoot truth. Later that night, as news anchors recapped the hearing and pundits scrambled for angles, Derek stood in front of the courthouse. No script, no podium, just him. He looked into the camera and said, "I told my story, not because it's special, but because it's familiar to familiar. If you've ever had to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's comfort, this was for you." He took a breath. One tape didn't fix it, but it cracked the wall. And that's how light gets in. Fade to black. Let the silence do the rest.